Hello and welcome to the Guardian Unlimited Books podcast. I'm Michelle Pawley and I'm very pleased to welcome into the studio today Jonathan Stroud, the author of the best-selling fantasy series The Bartimaeus trilogy. Hello Jonathan.
Hi there.
Now you're going to be reading from the last book in the series, Ptolemy's Gate, but first of all perhaps we could set the scene a bit by learning a bit more about the books and the characters, because this is quite an unusual trilogy, isn't it? It delves a lot more into politics, satire than a lot of fantasy series.
Yes, I had a lot of fun writing the three books in the series, mixing up various different types of genre. And they are fantasy books, first and foremost, but there's a tremendous amount of politics going on as well. Almost the first idea I had a few years ago when I was thinking about this was to reverse the normal genre conventions. And instead of having heroic human magicians fighting against the forces of evil, I would make the magicians themselves the bad guys. And I decided that they would all be politicians to boot, and that they would be ruling the country from the Houses of Parliament, and the Prime Minister would be a magician, and all his government would be magicians also. And so they're the bad guys, and the hero, if you like, or certainly the protagonist that we identify with most closely is Bartimaeus, who is a jinni, a 5,000-year-old jinni with a bit of a chip on his shoulder, who is a slave to one of these magicians.
Bartimaeus is really the hero of the series, isn't he? He's wisecracking, sarcastic. He's
a pretty charismatic sort of chap, and he thinks very highly of himself, rather too highly, in fact, and he's always falling on his backside as he goes along. But he's full of energy, and his voice is very humorous, and he uses footnotes all the time because he thinks of himself as being infinitely superior to all the readers out there. So he, in a way, is the guy that we identify with, although there are two other key protagonists. Nathaniel, a young boy magician who, in many respects, is fairly black, although he has idealistic elements too, and Kitty, a young commoner, a young ordinary person who is an enemy of both magicians and the jinn.
But Bartimaeus is the character who's used to provide the humour, often to puncture the pretensions of Nathaniel, isn't he? Because it is a humorous series of books. I made it out to sound quite dark and complex with all the satire and politics, but there is a lot of humour in there. Yeah,
very much so, and right from the beginning that was my intention, because I've always loved reading fantasy books, and yet certainly in the old days fantasy books I think generally were not renowned for their use of humour. I mean, Tolkien is not famous for his jokes. More recently, I think that's altered. I mean, there were many writers around. Terry Pratchett was perhaps one of the first. Dinah Wynne Jones, Owen Colfer, many different writers who are playing around with the genre. But it's quite nice now to puncture some of the highfalutin pretensions of the genre and bring it down to earth with a few cheap jokes.
And it's also quite a fast-moving read, isn't it? I mean, you've got explosions and chase sequences and torture scenes. It's quite rumbustious. You can see it really appealing to boys, I think.
Yes, I think so. Hopefully I'm aiming for a really wide readership, from quite young children through to grizzled adults of both sexes. But you're right, it's quite cartoony in a way, and the violence in it is the kind of violence you'd get in Asterix books, for example, where there's lots of movement and kinetic energy, but it's not actually that bloody. But yes, the politicians themselves are quite sinister, and there's a darker edge to a lot of the action, especially in the second and third books.
Well, particularly in the third book, there's a very dark ending. I don't want to give too much away here, but it does all get quite bloody, doesn't it? And quite violent, and it's quite a startling finale that goes on.
Yes, it's true. Yeah.
What's it like to say goodbye to your characters in that way?
Well, it was quite a pleasure, really, in a strange sort of way. I mean, I've been living with the characters for about 4 years, fairly continually, and it's they become totally three-dimensional and real to me. And at the same time, you have an obligation as a writer to your characters, and by that I mean you don't necessarily have to wrap them in cotton wool and protect them from the consequences of their own actions. It would be wrong to have an ending where, a bit like the A-Team, when people would do somersaults in cars and sort of blow up, and then they kind of get up, dust themselves down and hobble off. They haven't actually got even a scratch on them. That would be the wrong kind of ending. It's right to see that there's a moral consequence of one's actions.
And where do you go from here? You've had a best-selling trilogy. What next?
Well, it's a very good question, and I'm currently cloistering myself up, trying to write something a little bit different.